Welcome to the KIX EAP Podcast, your monthly podcast with important leaders in education from Eastern Europe, Middle East and North Africa, Central Asia, and the Asia Pacific. I'm your host, Ryan Allen, assistant professor at Soka University of America here in Orange County, California. My own background is in international and comparative education. Let's start the show. Today we have Dr. Elizabeth Cassity, Senior Research Fellow in the Education and Development Program at the Australian Council for Educational Research. We talk about her background, research with ACER, and collaboration in a global network. Let's go to the show. Dr. Cassity, thank you for joining us today. It's nice to have you on the podcast.
Oh, well, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be part of this.
Sure. Just looking over your educational background and sort of your work history, I'm really fascinated by the journey. You went to Southern Methodist University in Dallas for a bachelor's degree, and then for grad school, you were in Columbia in New York. Now you work in Australia, but if you look at the CV, there's really regions and places all over the world. So can you maybe talk a little bit about that kind of trajectory? And did you always sort of have these visions of kind of making those big leaps kind of around the world? And was international education, kind of a part of your thinking?
Well, thanks. It has been quite a journey, especially when you put it like that. But I was your typical student, got my bachelor's degree in English literature and communications, and was adventurous, and I just wasn't quite sure sort of where I wanted to be or what I wanted to do, other than to do something that would contribute and live in a different place and do something very, very different than what I'd been doing up until I was 22, 23 years old. So I ended up sort of working for a couple of years, saving some money, and then I joined World Teach and went to northern Namibia, where I was a teacher for 2 years, teaching English in an adult women's literacy program. It was just an amazing experience, life-changing experience for me. I loved it. I loved the work I was doing. And so when I left, I was working also with some very inspiring people, both in Namibia, but also from the States, sort of my co-teachers who come in that cohort with me. And, we talked about what we would do after that. And I decided, I think I'm going to do a master's in international development. So there I went from teaching in northern Namibia to I definitely want to do a master's in international development. But at the time, the reason I wanted to do that was to get a master's degree and then go right back out into the field and work. And I didn't know if it was going to be an NGO or the UN or something like that. But, I had this idea that would somehow just work. And then I got to Teachers College, Columbia University, and met my PhD advisor, who would become my PhD advisor. And she encouraged me to stay on and do a PhD, which is going to be, as you know, a lot more years and a lot more time and a lot more thinking. But I decided that really was the thing I wanted to do. And I did want to stay in research. So I spent the next several years in New York. I loved Teachers College. I loved my colleagues. I loved the faculty. The experience was really inspiring. And I ended up at that time doing my field work in Fiji and Australia. So I did my work, PhD in comparative education and history, and I looked at the development of the University of the South Pacific, which is based in Suva, Fiji, but it serves 15 Pacific Island countries. And I looked at it from the lens of world systems theory and sort of, critiquing how that would and wouldn't work. It was quite interesting because the Pacific was one of the regions that was sort of one of the last to decolonize. So there were, you're really kind of thinking in a great transformation throughout the 70s and 80s. So So I was quite inspired working there. And obviously, I remained in comparative and international education. I ended up going back to New York, obviously, to finish up my PhD. I ended up making some connections when I was here. And when I say here, I'm sorry, I'm located in Sydney, Australia at the moment. And but I did end up finishing my PhD and ended up coming back to Australia for personal reasons, which ended up being to my life now. So I moved back here. I didn't really have a position when I moved back to Australia, but I was doing some tutoring at universities, and then I eventually got a position as a senior researcher on an Australian Research Council linkage grant that was looking at Australian aid to education in 6 countries in the Asia Pacific region. That was 3 years full-time research and working for the chief investigator who I sort of met when I first came to Australia when I was doing my PhD research. So it was a really exciting time to sort of follow up on just to work and actually study what Australia was doing in terms of its aid to education programs. So I was able to maintain those links, certainly in international education. After that grant finished, I didn't have funding after that. As you probably know, that happens when you're the postgraduate life. What can I say?
Well, right. Yeah, I just did 8 years of research. Now I don't have a job like that. I definitely.
That's where I was. Yeah. So what did I do? I was able to get a job as a lecturer, but on contract at the University of Sydney. So the ARC grant was at the University of Sydney, and so I was teaching in the Faculty of Education and Social Work, and still doing small research, but it was just, it wasn't funded. It was, so it was a bit frustrating. And then my teaching load was huge. Sort of, as you know, sort of the early career, mid-career academic. So I taught really until 2012. And I wanted to love my work because I was working in the field that I wanted to, but I wasn't really loving it. And I just happened to come across an ad for a research fellow at the Australian Council for Educational Research. And they were sort of hiring a couple of research fellows in an area that ACER was starting to go into, which was education and development. So actually working in education in other countries. And I applied, and the next thing I knew, in March 2013, I was working as a research fellow at ACER, and I have not looked back since. And I really feel very lucky. And after all of that searching, I'm sort of in a spot that I really want to do now.
Wow, I love that. I love the story. I'm from Oklahoma, went to South Korea. I graduated from Teachers College myself. So yeah, I can relate, if you can believe it. I can relate. So that's wonderful. Maybe if we can talk a little bit about ACER, and you're a senior research fellow in the education and development program. So maybe can you tell me a little bit about that unit? And maybe just kind of like what kind of projects you're working on, and really like what does like a typical day look like for you in this role?
Sure. Now that's a big question, but I'll tell you. Well, the Australian Council for Educational Research, we have a nice, an interesting comparative education connections. So ACER is this year, I think we celebrated our 93rd anniversary. And ACER was actually established by a grant from the Carnegie Corporation in New York in 1930 in Melbourne, Australia. But now we've grown to an organization that's more than 450 employees, and with offices in 6 different countries. So it's really grown. Our focus is on research and teaching and learning, and also assessment. would probably be very familiar with the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, and several of the big assessments that ACER has a lot of experience in. That's not my background, but I've now become very familiar with assessment through my work. So I work with a college team. I guess we're about 10 or 12 people. I don't want to waste time thinking about exactly who's in my team, but we're a team called Education and Development, and based within education monitoring and research. So again, very, very research focused. Some of the projects that I'm working on, I am the ACER's project director / coordinator for the ACER ECAP partnership. So that's a long-term technical partnership with the Education Quality Assessment Program, which is the education branch, if you will, of the Pacific community. So it's a super exciting sort of long-term program of funded research and technical support for ECAP, which supports 15 different Pacific Island countries with any education needs. It's sort of a regional to national government approach. So that I can talk a little bit about that partnership later. So that's a major project. My other big project currently is the multi-year teacher development studies series, multi-year teacher development study series in Vanuatu, Laos, and Timor-Leste. And that's another long-term research program that's been funded by the Australian government that is looking at Australia's investments and their effectiveness of teacher professional learning programs in those three countries, Vanuatu, Timor-Leste, and Laos. And that's been a fascinating study. It's been a sort of a mixed methods approach and sort of quite unique in that we can talk about this a bit later, but in terms of its the big qualitative piece that it has. And it's funny about a typical day, because I know everyone probably says, oh no, if that exists, no day's the same. I was talking to one of my colleagues this morning and I said, it's a typical day. And she started laughing and she said, so this morning you were managing a research partnership, you were liaising with government, and then now you're coding data. And I'm like, that sounds really good. Yep, it's a typical day. But basically it has to do, there's a number of different research and projects that come out of the ECAP ACER partnership. So it's sort of liaising with my colleagues in the Pacific that are managing those programs, and that coordination is like a day-to-day experience. It's much very, very welcome. Some days are more intense than others. And I guess the liaising with government piece is I've just been liaising with our colleagues at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, so the Australian government donor agency, about some of the programs we're on, and we're sort of putting together, thinking through some presentations for some fairly big regional meetings in the Pacific that are coming up. So kind of thinking how we can work together to present some of the programs and activities in the Pacific. And then the coding data piece, that's the other typical part of my day, is yes, as part of this big multi-year teacher study, we have a major deadline. This is the last year, and that deadline is sort of the end of May for several reports. And we had a delay in getting some data toward the end of last year. So I actually was doing some of the final coding just this morning. I haven't quite finished it. I will do it tomorrow, but that's just some in vivo coding for the qualitative piece before we put it all together. So a typical day, it seems like chasing tails and tying up loose ends, if that makes sense. But it's all good.
Sure. And using in vivo. So I'm going to tell my students that it's, they got to keep trying to learn it. I know it's cumbersome, but it's helpful.
It's helpful. Yes, it is cumbersome, though. I totally agree.
Fantastic. One of the things you mentioned, sort of so many different projects that you're working on. You had the learning cycle 3 with us over here, and a couple of webinars as well. Learning assessments and education reform in the EAP region. I'll make sure to load those in the show notes so people can kind of have access to those. I think one of the things that you've kind of talked about, maybe or worked with a lot, is this idea of teacher training and professional development. So I'm kind of curious, especially thinking of that sort of, how do we use that data? How do we use those assessments to maybe inform teachers and to maybe bridge, if there is kind of a divide between, assessment and teacher professional development and teacher training. Can you maybe talk a little bit about some of those barriers potentially? And are there any really just success stories in teacher training that you've sort of worked with or seen out there?
Yeah, that's a really big question. I'm glad I got to think about these beforehand. um, there are success stories. Well, so I'll start with success. And I'm going to go back to that. I guess just as an example, that multi-year teacher development study program that we've been working on. One of the investment that I'll go back just a step. But the research that we're doing is funded by the Australian government, and they're interested in knowing sort of what works in terms of investing in teachers in Australia's AID programs. And one of the reasons for doing that program, or for sort of commissioning that research, if you will, was because after a review of investments between 2005 and 2015, there was no evidence that actually showed that any of these investments improved the quality of teaching or quality for teaching. So that's the reason why we're doing these studies. So a success story, I'm going to go back to our research in Timor-Leste, that particular country case study. And that's an example of a very focused program that invests in leaders, so principals and teachers. And it's oftentimes aid investments or donor investments can focus on education sector programs. So while it is funding education, and maybe it is or maybe it isn't doing good, the funds aren't as focused. But I think having funding for a program that is specifically focused on teachers, like and principles in terms of improving quality, and sort of implementing a curriculum and possibly improving student outcomes. I think we found that seems to be a positive way forward in terms of a program that is working. And I also want to single out that particular country program as well, because sort of the team that's implementing it sort of has this very takes on all of the research that and monitoring and evaluation, and takes it actively to sort of reform what's happening in the program. For example, tablet for school leaders are an important part of the program. But as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot of technical issues across the entire country of Timor-Leste to implementing those. So, but just taking up the most recent research, and they've actually used some of our interim research reports, which really surprises and pleases me. That's how I'd like to see research used. And actually shifted the program in a way that works. So they're actually sort of, it's like an active learning program, and the program, and they're able to have the flexibility to shift the program in ways that work to support teachers and teaching quality. I think in a way that I haven't seen in other countries before. It's not, and I guess the other thing is you would know, there's many programs tend to deliver sort of one-off workshops or one-off sessions for teachers, and then they'll go away, and but at least it ticks the box of offering something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way they started out doing this, but then realized teachers wanted more, and school leaders wanted more, and some of the programs just weren't sticking, because you can't just go in and sort of deliver a workshop and then 3 years later expect it to work in some really under-resourced environments like some schools are in Timor-Leste. So then they thought, well, we need to do some, either work the mentoring program in a different way, or sort of do sort of follow-up workshops. And they've done that. It's not perfect, but it's something, and I haven't seen that in a program. So that's a real sort of success story, I guess, that I could talk about, that sort of learning as you go and adapting. Some of the barriers, I guess, just aren't looking at data. Another barrier is too much data, not having access to the data. We all talk very happily about, say, well, they so and so, such and such international organization has collected a lot of student assessment data through this particular program, and so you would think that that's easy to access, but it's not, and it can be a real barrier in terms of permissions. So this whole sort of idea that something is publicly available possibly isn't quite the same in reality.
Sure. Wow. Yeah, that I love the success story. I mean, that's what we're looking for, right? We're trying to figure out what works and how we can, how we can improve things. So that's certainly wonderful to hear. And yeah, the data, you're only as good as your data, and if you don't have it or can't find it. So that's interesting. Actually, my next question is related to data, and I was really excited to see you were a qualitative researcher, at least you have background in qualitative research. And it seems like within this space, we often sort of lionize maybe quantitative research as sort of evidence, especially when we're trying to sort of make a case maybe to policymakers or to governments and things like that. So I'm curious if you feel sort of that tension maybe between the methodologies, and how is it getting qualitative research through to your government partners and your policymaker partners on the ground?
Thanks. I love that question. I think it's such a great question, possibly because I also, ACER is an organization that, quite often does a lot of these big quantitative, uses a lot of quantitative data in our research as well. But I do, yes, there is obviously that tension between the two methodologies. Certainly in development, the whole idea, quantitative research, the great advantages are that you can get a breadth of information about what's happening across a whole country. You can have trend data, which is, really critical to finding out sort of how, for example, students may be progressing in literacy and numeracy or not. And so I think that's really important. I guess the tension is the qualitative data. You're saying, well, I know from my perspective, I'm always saying, well, this is really important. We need to understand what's happening in the classrooms. I don't know many teachers that like sort of being summarized into one big statistic. I mean, every classroom, as you know, is really, really different, and every teacher's or principal's experience is really, really different. Every student is really different. And it's so important, I think, to understand really like what's happening in a classroom. So I guess it's sort of arguing about that. I'm not arguing, but just supporting the idea that depth as well is really important to understanding. I guess quantitative data can tell us a lot about what's happening. I always say this, but qual data gives us more of an opportunity to understand a little bit more why that might be happening. And obviously background questionnaires and big studies. I mean, I also work there. I mean, that also gives us a bit of an insight into the why answer. But I do think they can support each other so well, both quantitative and qualitative methodologies. And I think what's been it is rare to have studies funded, big qualitative studies funded, such as the multi-year teacher studies, and especially through the Australian government. So I think they've put a lot of faith in us, and we've been able to collect three rounds of qualitative data over 5 years. That was interrupted because of COVID, like everyone's world was. But we had that, and that's also enabled us to work really closely with in-country research teams, and having those teams be sort of the primary collectors of data, the primary researchers, and that's been very, very rewarding. But I guess qualitative research, and I've been with the teams in in all of the countries, in a number of the schools, and as well as sort of engaged with government. It helps us weave together that story. I'm not sure I like that word very much, but that story of the experience of teaching quality and teacher professional learning, sort of in each of those three countries. And to be quite honest, in Timor-Leste especially, it's been quite problematic to get student assessment data. In fact, it just really doesn't exist. So we've been working with not much quantitative data at all, and we had proposed a big sort of data collection around learning assessment, but as you might know, funding can also be an issue because those big studies cost a lot of money, as do qualitative research studies. I think it's been the best of all possible worlds, to be able to use a mixed method study and to, you're always making qualifying statements saying, well, look, we only, we're able to go to 6 schools in this particular province. But as well, for example, if you compare 2 provinces in Vanuatu, one province might be continually performing much better than another province, but interestingly, you might get some qualitative evidence that would say a number of those teachers are saying, well, look, we don't have resources, or, the government hasn't sent an education officer to conduct any professional learning support in 3 years, or we're very isolated. And somehow those two kinds of data align quite well. So it gives you more a whole story.
I teach Qual and Quant methods, so I can really appreciate that you're doing both together and in a real world setting and providing a real world example out there where it even gets funded. So that's really great to see, actually. If we could, I'm kind of curious about your hands-on research in the field. I know a lot of things with COVID were, through Zoom and things like that, but you do have experience, out there. I saw some background, Brazil, Zimbabwe, places around the world, and so can you kind of maybe tell me how you sort of, built your researcher toolkit, especially once you're kind of in the field? And I know that sometimes there's some practical disconnects with sort of grad schools and maybe training kind of programs. So what are kind of ways that you were able to potentially overcome, or did you see those things, or how did you learn once you got out there? What were you kind of learning once you got out in the field?
That's another really good question. I mean, I think I really hoped, when I was still at the university, or in a university context, I really wanted to work in a more collaborative context. And that's difficult because there's just not the numbers of people that are sort of working in your not your exact field, but your very, well, yeah, your exact field, or in, you know, comparative education, for example. There were, not many academics when I was there at the University of Sydney, and most, and not sort of, in the same field. So I guess I was, having a personal struggle. I mean, really, of how to make that work, and I wanted to, and I sort of experimented with collaborating with some colleagues across faculty, sort of in the School of Humanities at University of Sydney, and also the School of Law, through sort of like this Trans-Pacific agenda, and sort of that worked as an idea, but I think in practicality at a university, it was just really, really challenging. That's just the way things are. But as soon as you're in the field, things change. You have to adapt. It's very much real world. I think that was one of the reasons I wanted to join ACER, because I felt I really did want to work on larger research projects, and I felt I wanted to learn. So, especially in my field, the academic field of history and sociology, I was not involved in big programs. It really is sort of much, smaller focused case studies that you can afford and be funded by. And I did want to learn. So yes, I knew how to conduct interviews. I knew how to conduct observation, focus group interviews. I could even do a little bit of SPSS. But everything I felt competent, but I really wanted to build and just know. And so that's sort of what has been happening at ACER, certainly. I think the other thing is that when you're in the field, you're forced to, not forced, but you work in collaboration with partners, with other research partners, with governments. And I personally really like that. I like those conversations around research. And I really love working in big research teams where, people aren't so much arguing as saying, oh, now that's interesting. Oh, we need your bit of expertise here. Or I'm not sure this is the way. Or what do you think about going this way about doing it? And it's much more sort of, I guess I can say that both in the field and sort of working here at ACER, that it's much more of a team approach, and research is a conversation sort of about sort of what might work best, and how we might best get to where we want to be. So I have learned a lot of those skills, like a lot of those collaborative skills, as well, since working in the field. And I've learned some new things that I thought I, never would have learned by, working with some smaller research organizations in the countries where we work. Things like, contracting, with an entity in another country, and it might be a non-government organization, and getting through sort of our legal and their legal, and finding translators for languages that aren't sort of widely spoken. I mean, those are things you probably never, I certainly didn't expect, even until, even when I joined ACR, I didn't expect to, have to find, sort of translators and transcribers for languages that there's not a lot of that skill and number of people out there. So I guess it's all good fun, but boy, there's some days when you do really want to tear your hair out. But I have looked back and I thought, wow, I know a lot more now than I did, like, say, even 2 or 3 years ago. So it is like that constant learning. And I think that is also sort of just the excitement and engagement, and that is sort of being in the field.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I again, another hopeful note of, sometimes you want to pull your hair out, but you look back and yeah, you've grown a lot, or learned a lot. So that's wonderful. We're kind of coming to the the end of the interview. And, one of the things that we wanted to talk to you, I know ACER has a lot of work with, Pacific Island states. The KIX EAP hub, we're sort of adding countries like Fiji, Marshall Islands, Samoa, among others. So maybe if you can just kind of talk about how do you, or advice to sort of the region and to sort of people working together of like, how do you coordinate across these sorts of, different places and different people and different languages and, oceans between? Maybe some final parting words of wisdom to those of us that might be taking on those roles here in the near future.
Yeah, that's exciting, and I was thrilled. I'm thrilled to hear that the GPE KIX is sort of now moving into the Pacific Islands region. And as you know, ACER is a strategic partner for the East Asia and Pacific region as part of Hub 3. So that's really, really great news. And I guess the Pacific Island countries, the region is an exciting region to work in and to work with. It's an incredibly diverse region. If I were to give advice to anyone, I would say just to listen. There's a lot of knowledge and experience in this part of the world, and as I mentioned before, like as ACR, we work in partnership through the Pacific community. So there's a lot of work that's done through regional organizations, and that's been really helpful, sort of in mediating our way in sort of supporting the region. Not only in terms of research and capacity support for technical expertise, but I guess specifically in thinking about KIX is supporting knowledge exchange sort of through that regional network. And it's the Pacific region seems to do it better than anyone as a region. I mean, every region of the world has its own politics and challenges, but I think that there are very strong networks and people, so be they ministers or regional representatives or agency representatives, governments, schools in the region are really, really focused on education, especially with the challenges, that of climate change, rising oceans. Like, these are issues that are palpable for this region. And so I think people are very engaged and they are very interested in connections and, really how knowledge can be exchanged to sort of better education for all, if you will. Hope that didn't sound too cheesy.
No, I mean, that's exactly what we're doing here. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Cassity, for joining me today. This has been really wonderful. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Ryan. It's been a great opportunity, and I've just been, really pleased to be included as part of this podcast. Thank you very much.
And this concludes our KIX EAP podcast, which is released every first Wednesday of the month. Of course, the opinions expressed on the KIX EAP podcast are solely those of the host and the guest. The KIX EAP podcast is made possible by KIX, which stands for Knowledge and Innovation Exchange. KIX is an initiative of the Global Partnership for Education. Globally, KIX is administered by the International Development Research Center in Canada. NORAG in Geneva hosts one of the 4 regional hubs of KIX. Find us on the NORAG or GPE KIX websites. You can subscribe to the KIX EAP podcast, newsletter, and webinar series, and also learn about KIX global or regional projects. Additionally, you can subscribe directly on Spotify or SoundCloud to receive notifications of the new monthly podcast. Find us on the NORAG or GPE KIX websites. You can subscribe to the KIX EAP podcast, newsletter, and webinar series, and also learn about KIX global or regional projects. Additionally, you can subscribe directly on Spotify or SoundCloud to receive notifications of the new monthly podcast. Thanks for listening.